Well, hello, and a very warm welcome indeed to a rather special Geraldine Jamieson interview. Joining me down the line from New York is Tony Robbins, historic preservation consultant, writer, university lecturer, walking tour leader, etc., and amongst his books, Classics of American Architecture, The World Trade Center, which was published in 1987. Well, Tony Robbins, great to have you join me on the programme today.
Oh, Geraldine, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Tony, you yourself have written a book on the Twin Towers entitled Classics of American Architecture, The World Trade Center. Outline its salient points. And where did you begin exactly?
Well, the book was sort of an accident. You know, back in the 1980s, New Yorkers, and we can't remember this anymore because it's just become, the emotions are just too big. But New Yorkers hated the World Trade Center, by and large. To us, it seemed like an unnecessary intrusion in the skyline, two boring towers. You know, it was a government project rather than any of the earlier buildings that held the title of world's tallest buildings were built by either corporations, or like the Chrysler Building, or just developers, and therefore they had a certain amount of panache. And we have two giant towers put up by the Port Authority of New York. Out-of-towners, on the other hand, adopted them as the symbol of New York. Sort of remarkable. So I was called in by a book packager to write a book about the Chrysler Building, much more my cup of tea, to be part of a series called Classics of American Architecture. And at the last minute, the publisher said, well, you know, we'd like to start with the World Trade Center. He was an out-of-towner. Do you mind? I said, well, no, of course not. As long as I get to do the Chrysler Building later. That never happened. The series came and went. But it turned out to be a much more interesting project than I'd imagined. The whole story of how the Trade Center came to be, how the planning worked, why it's located where it is, the way the design developed, the engineering that made it possible. And so I ended up writing what somebody kindly later called the first serious book on the World Trade Center as a piece of architecture and planning. It was unlike the usual things I worked on. In this case, the principals were all still alive. I could interview them. There were thousands of pages of documents stored in the archive of the Port Authority, which I got to go through. Those, of course, all perished in the disaster. So you couldn't do today what I was able to do then, just because of that. But it was a remarkable experience, and one I'm very glad I had. Of course, the book went out of print almost immediately. Nobody cared about the Trade Center in the 1980s. What can I tell you?
It's almost unbelievable that nobody cared.
Well, they cared about it as a place to go as a tourist, go up to the top because the views were stunning. But again, I lectured on the subject off and on during the 80s and 90s, and New Yorkers in the room all said the same thing. Why did you bother? And out-of-towners all said the same thing. Wow, that's New York. And, I think that explains a couple of things. It explains why the monsters who plotted this thing picked the World Trade Center, because they were, so to speak, out-of-towners, and that was the symbol of New York. And in New York City, nobody that I ever heard of clamored to rebuild the towers as they had been. If, God forbid, it had been the Empire State Building,
Indeed,
I think you would have heard New Yorkers rise up and say, put it back the way it was. That didn't happen with the Trade Center.
But it is extraordinary, really, when, of course, the Twin Towers were so much taller.
Well, 100 feet. They were just 100. They're just 100 feet taller, and that tells you something about why that height was chosen. It was to break the record. The thinking to make it the world's tallest building apparently began in the public relations department of the Port Authority. I put that in my draft. The head of the Port Authority, a man named Guy Tizzoli, who's been called the father of the World Trade Center, took exception to that, invited me to lunch at Windows on the World, up at the top of the towers. And we chatted, and he said, I've always had, he said, a marketing bent, and I knew that if we were going to do something in New York and get noticed, we had to do something really, really big, which is just the same thing as saying that this is public relations. But that's why all the world's tallest towers, at least the ones that built in New York, have been as tall as they are. It's all about advertising. It's all about public relations. It's all about being noticed. We are the city of Madison Avenue. This is who we are. This is what we do. Well, I'm bringing back the book into a second edition. It will, I hope, be available shortly on Amazon.com, including in the UK. And it's just the same book as in the 80s, but I've added to it an appendix with some of the documents that I have in my files that, the originals no longer exist. Things from the 70s and 80s, brochures, pieces of the search for an architect that really sort of give a sense of what it was like then. It's a sense that we just can't have anymore. And I think that makes it a more interesting book. I hope so.
Well, you've devoted your life to the protection of New York City's landmarks, and you lead, of course, walking tours around the city. You're obviously a passionate New Yorker. What does this city mean to you personally?
Everything. It's my home. It's the subject of my work. I can't imagine living any place but New York. I've seen it. When you get to be my advanced age of 60, you see the city. If you've lived in the same place all those years, you see the city through layers. I walk past sites and I see it as it is now, and I see it as it was 20 years ago, and I see it as it was 40 years ago. So it's sort of an all-encompassing place. It's also, we're the most diverse. That's the word of the hour. I think we're the most diverse city in the world in terms of our population. So living here is like living in the center of the world. The students in our public schools come from families speaking 180 different languages. And we've always been this way. And back when we were a Dutch colony in the 1600s with just a few thousand people, a visitor to New Amsterdam, as we were called then, wrote that he counted 18 languages spoken in the streets, even then. So in a sense, whatever there is in the world, for good or bad, by the way, but whatever there is, you'll find it in New York, but double. All right, that's a New Yorker speaking. We're impossible. What can I tell you?
Well, you must meet hundreds of tourists through your work. Are the 9/11 attacks, something that regularly come up in conversation with visitors to the city?
In the immediate aftermath, of course. In more recent years, it's been more a question of, well, when are they going to finish the replacement? And it's really rather embarrassing, I have to say, that it's taken this long. It's understandable. It's like the original Trade Center took so long. It's for the same reason, politics. The Trade Center was built by a state authority, actually a bi-state authority, the Port Authority. The city had no say in it. There were conflicts there. Similar things going on here, plus all the emotion. Rudy Giuliani suggested that nothing should be built there. But to me, that's a mistake. And clearly the decision was made to build there. Life has to go on. Does it need a memorial of some kind? Of course. But the best memorial, in a way, is that we don't let it stop us.
Did New York change forever after 9/11, or is it now business as normal?
Well, I'm certain some things have changed. Certainly walking around downtown, the financial district, you can't help but notice all of the streets blocked to traffic and safety bollards sitting in the street to keep cars coming down. The security measures are just enormous. That's a huge change. It used to be somebody who takes people on walks to the city, like I do, is more apt to notice this. You can't walk into lobbies of office buildings downtown anymore. You just can't do it without permission, without being on your way to see somewhere. And before 9/11, that simply wasn't an issue. So the level of security has certainly changed. And that's very visible. When it comes to 9/11, I can only speak for myself and my friends, but the subject of conversation is generally, you mean they haven't finished that thing yet? Referring to the rebuilding. It's finally happening. One tower is completed, another tower is way up in the air. The memorial, we hope, is going to be ready to open on the 10th anniversary. But apart from that, in New York, I guess it's fair to say that life goes on because life goes on. That's how life works.
So finally, really, the future for New York City, are people really optimistic?
Well, quite apart from 9/11, in the last 20, 30 years, New York has had something of a renaissance. The city 30 years ago, when I came back from graduate school in England to New York, the city, the 1970s, was a very dark and dangerous place. It was teetering on financial bankruptcy. Anybody who would leave left. And that's all changed. I wouldn't have recommended anyone walk around Times Square in 1975. It just wasn't a very safe thing to do, and there was not much to do there. And now it's just jam-packed with tourists. There are those New Yorkers who don't like the commercialization of Times Square, but that's another story. In many ways, the city is living something of a golden age, and it's been headed that way for the last 20 years. So it's a wonderful place to be. The specter of the disaster is always there, I suppose, somewhere in the back of our minds. And right now, I'm sure it's getting closer to the front of people's minds because this anniversary is here. But New York goes about its business. I mean, I think that's really what we do. We just get on with it. I mean, everybody's different. We have 8.25 million people living here, and you'll get asked that question of 8.25 million people. I suspect you'll get 8.25 million different answers. Yeah, but that's my feeling.
Well, my guest today has certainly devoted his professional life to the protection of New York City's landmarks and indeed to the education about the city's history and architecture. Tony Robbins, it has been both appropriate and an honour to have you join me down the line from New York on Manx Radio's Geraldine Jamieson interview. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Geraldine. It's been a pleasure for me too.